I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not write over the door. So I turned to the garden of love, that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. On first reading, the text conjures up the classical image of an idyllic garden, full of flowers, trees, and children playing in the green, at the heart of a garden in which the briars, mentioned in the last stanza, may only seem to be growing on the periphery.
Yet, in the first stanza already, the poetic voice describes the transformation of the garden into a building site for an imposing chapel. As suddenly as their presence is suggested, the children playing there disappear, making room for the great doors of the chapel, which immediately shut and forbid any sense of perspective and depth.
All around, the atmosphere becomes unwelcoming, with the sign on the doors setting the tone. Here, everything is forbidden and severity prevails. The idyllic garden thus morphs into a graveyard. This is actually a garden with no flowers or plants, no colors, no children, only ecclesiastics guarding the place in their black monks' frocks, armed with briars to entrap those who would dare to go and explore the garden.
The initial lively and cheerful garden thus proves to have become a hostile, ascetic place, full of briars, that is to say, brambles, tangles of wild, prickly plants. Whereas the latter may have originally appeared as harmless reminders of nature's original state, they ultimately take center stage, growing everywhere, reaching every inch of the once happy garden.
To further analyze this poem, let us leave the intradiegetic level behind. In other words, let us shake off the referential illusion, that is to say the initial impression for the reader to actually see a garden, in order to dwell on the extradiegetic level, in other words, the elements that both remain outside the scene and frame it.
It would be tempting to consider the image of the poetic voice not recognizing the garden where he used to play as a replica of the fall from the Garden of Eden, here with the transition from a lush and vibrant garden to a cemetery. Yet several elements are worth noticing to nuance this point. To begin with, there is no couple here, only a single individual caught between a bygone childhood and the early stages of adulthood. He or she is obviously expecting the garden to be the garden of love, which indicates he or she is looking for a partner. Now, this partner is conspicuously absent from the scene. One could imagine that it is because the partner has already been excluded from the garden, but it is obviously not the case. Rather than exclude, the garden entraps those who are tempted to enter it, and by forbidding them everything, metaphorically turns them into the inhabitants of a cemetery. From a formal viewpoint, the gradual sensation of entrapment experienced by the poetic voice, when realizing that the garden has become a dead end, is particularly supported and suggested by the meter and rhyming scheme of the poem.
The first and second stanza follow an apparently rigid formal order, with tetrameters and a similar rhyming scheme following the ABCB pattern. Yet, within that rigid frame, the pattern of each verse is iamb, pyrrhic, trochee, and iamb. In other words, this apparent rigid order barely manages to contain chaos, which is intensified in the second verse, with the first 3 verses running with 4 feet and 1 extra syllable. Ultimately poetic, chaos prevails in the third and last stanza. It opens with 2 irregular tetrameters, and ends with a pentameter and a final alexandrine, which, one would be tempted to say, suggests chaos prevail over order. Yet, here again, on closer inspection, what prevails is not so much chaos as an alternative, possibly more organic order, as the internal rhymes in the last 2 verses suggest.
All in all, the poem thus transfigures both the topos of the fall from the Garden of Eden and the rigid, poetic form of its day and age, thereby refocusing the initial image and foregrounding the individual challenge of the individual poetic voice in front of an oppressive society.
With the image of the chapel, the poet also transfigures the new Georgian order, particularly when it comes to Anglicanism. Here Blake indisputably targets the Anglican Church, which had been one of the political weapons of the Hanover monarchy to restore religious order in the kingdom, after decades of dissent that had culminated in the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, meant to restore a Catholic king.
In 1753, the Parliament of Great Britain passed the Clandestine Marriages Act, which required anyone wishing to get married to do so in the Anglican Church, regardless of their religion. This allowed the Anglican Church to impose its control over all other forms of worship.
Here, William Blake lampoons the Church's redefinition of marriage into a political tool, heedless of the gospel celebration of love. By focusing on the phrase, "Thou shalt not," the formal opening words in each of the 10 Commandments, he raises the meaning of God's word, the better to highlight the key paradox of his day and age. Even though the 18th century was meant to be the age of enlightenment, Blake pictures it here as an age of obfuscation or darkness. In other words, by casting love into the shadow, by shutting the door of the chapel and covering it with a sign of repression, or by replacing the flowers with grace, the age of enlightenment becomes an age of denial. The transformation of the Garden of Love thus represents not so much the fall from the Garden of Eden as the fall of religion, as it has lost its substance.
As the expression of love, the poetic voice's desires are thus censored. It is indeed unclear what specific desires the poetic voice refers to when he evokes "my joys and desires." On first reading, this censorship could be recognized as an early instance of balderism, that is, the practice of removing supposedly indecent passages from literary works or from the public space. But Blake is far from supporting the contemporary doxa or the suppression of desires. On the contrary, the very title of the poem suggests a double irony, not only that of the poetic voice's coming of age and realization that his childhood is gone and that love has been adulterated, but also that of the poetic voice's resilience in the face of an oppressive environment. Indeed, the last word of the last line speaks volumes. His desires remain and suggest an ongoing battle between two natural forces in the garden: humanity's desires versus the brambles of repression.
Ultimately, William Blake thus advocates a return to primeval values, a return to a state in which humans are free to express their true nature through genuine love. In as many words, that is the very definition of romanticism, which Blake, among others, ushered into being through its bittersweet poetic works.